There are estimates that 1 billion animals have died in this season's bushfires, but with millions of hectares burnt, what's going to happen to our plants and forests? Many native species have evolved to bounce back quickly or even thrive after fires. But ecologists are worried that our landscapes are being pushed to the limit. Mike Clark is Professor of Zoology at La Trobe University and studies the ecological impacts of fires. Welcome to RN Breakfast, Mike.
Thanks, Norman.
Do we know yet how much damage has been done to our plants and forests, given that we haven't yet finished the bushfire season?
We don't. The crucial thing that needs to be done is mapping of the severity and identifying where unburnt patches remain, and that's still an ongoing process.
But what feedback are you getting back from the fire grounds so far?
The striking difference with these fires is the way they have burnt through bits of the landscape that we would normally not expect to burn. The damp gullies that we thought in the past would pull up a fire, because of the dryness, the extraordinary drought we've been through, the fires are proceeding through what should have been refuges.
And are those refuges, do they harbour species that are not fire resistant?
Absolutely. And that's the chilling and confronting part for an ecologist. Much of the landscape has plants and animals with adaptations for coping with fire, but these rainforests exist in the absence of fire. And it's not obvious what adaptations they're going to possess because of that evolutionary history.
And it's hard to believe that it's never been through those areas before. I mean, fires have been part of the Australian landscape probably for millions of years, not just since humans have walked on our land. I mean, shouldn't our bushland be able to recover?
It's the frequency of those fires and the severity. You're quite right. There will have been historically, geologically, the occasional fire that's gone through a rainforest. But we're talking of gaps of 200 to 300 years between fires at least. And some of these places are now being burnt far more regularly than that. And we're seeing whole state changes in the nature of the vegetation that comes back afterwards.
To what extent do you think we're going to lose rare species of plants and trees, given the geography of the bushfires at the moment and what we know about their pattern across Australia?
Well, the estimates that have been done rapidly while these fires have been burning put it at 70 nationally threatened species have lost at least 50% of their the national range. So that's half of their range has been burnt by fires. That's a huge blow to species that were already on their knees.
How does this, we're talking about, everybody's been picking apart, a lot of talk about cuddly koalas. I'm not being cynical there, but they become an emblem, if you like, of the animal population that's been damaged and died and been killed. But we're talking about total ecosystem here. We're talking about insects, we're talking about birds, we're talking about pollination. When you look at the total ecosystem, it's not just a eucalypt seed bursting open after a fire. It's that total ecosystem. And what's your assessment of that?
I think we've got a long way to go to understanding it. I think your point is absolutely correct, and I'd go further. We're talking about ecosystem processes down in the soil with the microbes, with the fungi that determine nutrient cycling. These fires have been so hot because the soils have been so dry that some of those fundamental processes that underpin how our ecosystems work may have been affected long term. So we've got lots to learn both about how our soils work and also what the impact of these fires has been on soils.
The issue here is how much resilience is there in the system, isn't it?
It is, and we've lived with a myth for a number of years that we shouldn't worry about these things. The Australian bush will bounce back. Just wait and see. And it will be green in a couple of months. But the devil's in the detail in terms of how long it takes for some of the key resources, particularly that the animals need, to survive. So the glossy black cockatoo on Kangaroo Island feeds on drooping sheoak. Those sheoak seeds, those trees, if they recover, won't be producing seed for 10 to 40 years' time. So we have these gaps. Some trees might be back, but will the resources that the animals need immediately be provided?
But you'll also have animals foraging for food. Will they eat the seedlings?
Well, that's right, and that's a critical issue in much of eastern Australia, where we'll have the wrong animals eating the seedlings and competing with the native animals. So
So you're talking about sheep and
deer, rabbits, horses in our forests. It's now is the time to get on top of those feral herbivores because of the plant damage they're doing and the habitat damage they'll be doing straight after the fire. They'll be concentrated in those unburnt remnants.
So we need to get on with culling.
We do. We need to be really proactive now to give the native wildlife a chance to come back, because those unburnt refuges are the sources of recolonisation.
Is anybody realising this? I mean, is anybody?
Yeah, there's terrific response from a couple of state governments and the federal government, but I think the magnitude of the challenge still needs to sink in. There's been some really good commitments from both federal and state governments, but they are only initial down payments on what's an enormous toll on our wildlife, and I think we're needing to get a bit more serious in terms of resourcing.
What about domestic cats?
Yeah, feral cats are a huge problem. They've been shown to actually move towards burnt areas to pick off wildlife that has survived. The wildlife that has survived has no cover to hide in, and so it's particularly vulnerable. So feral cats and feral foxes need to be addressed at the same time, and it's a golden opportunity, and we mustn't miss it.
There's a rule in biology that a vacuum is filled, and a vacuum here will be filled, if you're talking about slow-growing species that are native, by invasive species. What kind of invasive species might move into these bushfire areas?
I guess we'll be looking at blackberry, lantana, boneseed, a number of species like that people have been chipping away at for years. And the very nature of a weed is that it loves a disturbance. That's its window of opportunity, and they have all these adaptations to exploit it. We need to be on the front foot.
How can you be on the front foot when it's an area the size of what it is now, but Belgium?
Yeah, it's challenging. There's no doubt, no escaping that. But I think it's getting serious as a nation. I think we haven't been in terms of resourcing. Our land management agencies have been underfunded for years, and now is the time to step up. And I think the chickens have come home to roost, and we need to do serious resourcing. To put it in perspective, the announcement by the federal government is equivalent to about what we'd spend in Victoria on 6 kilometres of the Princess Highway duplication. That's the total national response so far. And I concede it's a down payment, they've acknowledged that, but we're going to really need to get much more serious than that. And
the role of seed banks to reseed rare plant species? I mean,
There's some work being done that, and some commitments made for improving the seed banks. That is the insurance policy. But when you're doing it on scale, a limited source of seed becomes really challenging. Alpine ash is a classic example. I gather from some foresters they're concerned, can they provide enough seed to restore alpine ash forests which have been burnt too frequently?
Troubling. Mike Clark, thanks for joining us.
A pleasure.
Mike Clark is Professor of Zoology at La Trobe University.